Hello everybody, this video is a quick one to answer a question from the comments. We're going to be comparing the advantages of axial compressors versus centrifugal compressors. Big muscle, this answer is for you. Alright everybody, welcome back. School is in session. Today I'm answering a question, like I said in the intro. I'm answering a question that was posted by Big Muscle in the comments to my video that's called 3 types of compressors used in jet engines. In that video I showed axial compressors and centrifugal compressors. And the question was, what are the advantages of axial compressors over centrifugal compressors, and why centrifugal compressors are not used so much anymore. Actually, they're not used anymore. Axial compressors, for those that haven't seen the other video, although you should go back and watch that video, centrifugal compressors are you have an impeller. This is what turbochargers have nowadays. As a compressor, you have an impeller that grabs the air and flings it radially out. This is looking down the intake of the engine or the turbocharger or whatever the compressor, and has an impeller that flings the air radially outward into a bigger section. It's called a diffuser. Let me draw a sideways view of that. This would be the intake of the engine, the center of the impeller wheel. And as this rotates, it flings the air radially out, imparting speed onto the air. The incoming air gets sped up and shot out the sides, radially outward in all directions. There's a diffuser that changes direction to that flow of air and feeds that into a combustor, which eventually funnels the air through a turbine and a nozzle and goes out the back. There's your jet engine. This type of compressor is limited by how fast you can turn it before it blows itself apart, and how big you can make it, because you can imagine the bigger you make it, the more centrifugal forces it experiences, until you reach a size limit where if you spun it fast enough, it would just pull itself apart. It's so heavy. There's a limit. You can stack these back to back to a maximum of 2 stages. This would be your first stage of compressor. You could, in theory, add a second stage, a second impeller behind it. And then this air would have to make a series of 90-degree turns to be funneled into here, to be fed to the second stage impeller. And then this would in turn fling it out to the combustors at a higher pressure. You can't do any more than 2 stages. This would give you usually the output pressure, the compressor discharge pressure of this is about 80, 90, 100 psi, I think. I'm shooting, don't quote me on that, I'm shooting from the hip, going off memory. But you can't stack up any more of these, because the third one would have to be spinning so fast that it would reach a speed limit. It would blow itself apart. It would be more of a restriction than a compressor. So disadvantages of the axial compressor oh, my apologies, centrifugal compressor. Disadvantages are limitations of how the highest pressure that you can reach, the size of the compressor itself, the volume of air that it can process to produce thrust. Because look at this. This here is the size of your intake. All of the air that you're using, processing through the engine to turn into thrust, is all the air that you can squeeze through that intake. Turning this way, looking at this front view, look how beautiful that is. The total size of the engine is this. This is the profile. This is what's hit, what you're presenting to the oncoming air. This is the size of the engine, and yet the only air that's coming at the engine that you can actually use to process and run through the engine to produce thrust is the size of your intake. So you're creating, you're dragging along all this drag, and yet the only air that you can process through the engine to produce thrust is limited to this area. That's because you had to, in this type of design, the centrifugal design, you depend on having this shape where you're starting from the inside and flinging the air outwards. So you're starting from here, air is coming in here and being flung outwards. So there's a big drag penalty for this type of design, for this type of engine. Now, there's even more inefficiencies with this design, because now you're changing the direction of air so many times that each one of those directions changes translates to energy loss. You're investing energy into changing the direction of the airflow. And this is one 90-degree turn that the air has to make. This is another 90-degree turn. Here's another 90-degree turn. There's another 90-degree turn. Here's another yet again, and so on and so forth. And the air is going through a labyrinth to make its way through the engine. All that translates to energy loss. On the other hand, so you're limited on the maximum pressure that you can produce with these. You're limited on the amount of air that you can move through it, because if you needed to move more air, if you can't increase the pressure, you need to increase the volume, the mass of air that you're moving through the engine. You just make the engine bigger, and then bigger, and bigger, and you get to a point that this impeller in the compressor is so big that you can't spin it fast enough. It'll blow itself apart. So there's a size limit, therefore a thrust limit out of what you can get out of this type of engine. So higher drag, limits on thrust, limits on pressure, and they're heavy. On the other hand, axial compressors. All right, here's a couple more things that I wanted to add. In the video that I may keep mentioning about the three types of compressors, I show an engine that has the centrifugal type compressor, but it's you will notice on the video that it's a double-sided single stage compressor. Single stage meaning that it's only one stage, not stacked up two one after the other, but it is a double-sided single stage, because the one stage, the one compressor impeller, is double-sided. It's not only sucking air from one side, from the front of the engine, but it's sucking air from both sides of the impeller. It actually has a wire mesh screen on both sides of this, so that it can actually suck air in from both sides of the impeller. That does not increase the pressure. That increases the volume, because now you're doubling up the size of the intake. And basically now you just doubled up the amount of intake area that you have on one particular engine. So I wanted to address that. That double-sided single stage does not increase the overall compression pressure of the engine, and increases the volume that this engine is capable of moving. These engines, another disadvantage is that these engines are normally housed inside the fuselage of the airplane. Inside the airframe itself is not exposed outside, and it depends. Given that it lives inside of the fuselage, it depends on funny ductwork inside of the fuselage, usually from two side scoops like that come in together inside of the engine inside of the airframe to feed the engine inside of the airframe, and then it jets out the back. What that means is you're losing even more energy from the flow because of the boundary layer. All the drag that this incoming air is dragging itself along the fuselage and then down the ductwork and changing direction even more times before it even makes it to the engine itself. So those are more inefficiencies per se, versus axial engines that you do have exposed way on the outside of the fuselage itself, in what they call podded configuration. Podded meaning that the engine is sitting on a pylon away from the wing, away from the fuselage, so that if you look at the airplane from the front, you have the engines hanging underneath the wings, or in the case of the Honda Jet, on top of the wing, or many other engines where they're attached to the fuselage but hanging out the back, somewhere outside of the fuselage, so that the engine itself is exposed to a free incoming intake charge, separate from the boundary layer and slower moving air that's dragging its way on the fuselage. That's another advantage of this versus that being a disadvantage on this. Now, having said all that, modern engines nowadays, there is still a place for centrifugal compressors, because one stage of a centrifugal compressor has a pressure increase that is far greater than one stage of an axial compressor. In an axial compressor, you can keep stacking up stages to keep increasing and ramping up that pressure until you get to whatever pressure you want to get to. But each individual stage has a small pressure increase. However, on a single stage centrifugal compressor, the pressure increase is pretty great, it's pretty big. So where you do see centrifugal compressors in modern day aircrafts is on engines that combine both advantages of each design. For example, I think it's the Garrett or Honeywell TFE 731. It has an axial compressor that discharges its compressed air into a single stage axial compressor, and then from there it goes to the combustors and whatever. But the advantage of that is that now you can get away with a smaller impeller, compressor wheel, because the air that you're feeding into it is already pressurized, and it's pressurized to whatever pressure you want to get to by an axial compressor in front of it. So these engines, we do have a lot of those. In aviation, there is a lot of those. In turboprops, that combination of having an axial compressor first, compressing the air, and then feeding the already compressed air into a single stage axial compressor. This gives you a great increase in pressure in a single stage, in a small space. So that gives it a final kick in the pants to compress it even more one last time before feeding it to the combustors. On the other hand, axial compressors where you have the entire area of the intake available to run through the engine. If this is your central shaft, you can add as many stages. Remember how you were only limited to 2 stages in the radial, the centrifugal type of compressor. In the axial type of compressor, you can keep adding stage after stage after stage, as many as you want to increase the final compressor discharge pressure. The only limiting factor to how many stages and how high of a pressure you can reach here is the combustion temperatures. You can actually compress this enough to the point that now you're reaching the limits of the metal of the turbines and the combustor liners and all that. So you're going to compress the air here, and now your limit becomes the materials downstream. You can't actually reach high enough temperatures here to melt everything else down here, the downstream of the combustors. These engines were producing a maximum pressure of 80 to 100 psi. Again, don't quote me on that, but it's somewhere in that vicinity. Modern axial compressors are so good that compressor discharge pressure is upwards of 600 psi. That is a lot. You get a lot more energy output for the same amount of fuel, the higher the pressure in your combustors is. So that not only makes that engine more efficient, that means that you can get a lot higher output from a smaller engine, because that engine compresses the same air and fuel to much higher pressures. Now look at the difference in the shape and therefore the drag of these two designs of engines. Here, this is the amount of area available to process air through the engine versus all this drag due to the shape of the engine. In an axial engine, you have almost the entire profile, the entire shape of the engine available to move air through the engine, except for, you know, all your internals and wheels and whatever inside. But you have most of this size available to move air through the engine and therefore produce thrust. So axial engines, smaller packaging for a lot more power, and these engines you can scale up to a much bigger size because they don't have to spin as fast as these impellers do. These impellers are winding themselves way up high. These are not spinning as fast, especially when you add a fan. Well, if you compare size one to the other, if you tell me, well, these were something else to consider. If these were smaller and these engines are bigger, and they're so much bigger now because now you're adding a fan in front of the engine. Let's say you're adding a fan blades, and now this is a high bypass engine. You would have a much bigger frontal area with the fan blades in front of this, and you would say, well, that's a lot bigger shape, a lot bigger object moving through the air, therefore a lot more drag. Well, if the engine was not turning, that would be the case. But now this bigger area is all sucking air in and blowing it out the back. So this is not drag, this is area that's all producing thrust. Versus here, this area is air getting sucked in to produce thrust. This is all drag. How's this for a professional drawing? I'm just joking. My pen doodles are just an aid to make sense of what I'm talking about. Anyways, that's just about what I can think of now. Like I said, shooting from the hip, a quick video, a quick answer to the question from the comments. Hit me up. Any comments, any questions? Big Muscle, I hope I answered your question. I hope this helps to illustrate the advantages of one versus the other, and the disadvantages of one, why one was kind of phased out as this design was developed further, and they realized all the advantages of this. However, there is one application where this design of compressor, the centrifugal compressor, is still being used, and that is on remote control jet engines, where you have an engine that has this sort of shape. This is the reason for the shape is because you have, and this is a single stage centrifugal compressor jet engine where you have one impeller in the front flinging the air out to a combustor, which is here, and here you have shafts and bearings and whatever in the middle, and then back here you have an axial flow turbine. So this air gets compressed through here, gets burnt, and gets fed through an axial flow turbine, and then it gets ejected out the back, and there's your thrust. RC remote control jet engine compressors, the jet engines, are still, due to their simplicity, a centrifugal type compressor design. Anyways, like always, I hope you liked it. Again, I hope I clarified and I answered your question. Any more questions, feel free to leave it in the comments. Let me know. Thank you guys, stay safe. See you next time.